I'm very happy to host today Nina Eidsheim, who is currently located in Los Angeles. She's a professor at the University of California at Los Angeles. Very blessed to have her around, and we're going to discuss the topic of voice and race and voice and racism as well. Before I ask my first question, I would like to frame the introduction to our discussion in slightly, philosophical terms and philosophical way, because I'm a trained philosopher. At the very beginning of Nina's recent and wonderful book called The Race of Sound, she poses the question that guides her discussion throughout the book. It is the question that she names the acousmatic question. And thinking about it, it really reminds me a fair bit about the fundamental question in philosophy of, namely that of self-knowledge, or knowing oneself and therefore knowing people around you. So when I think about this fundamental question, self-knowledge, which is perhaps the key question that a human being can ask themselves, I think about a particular cluster of my beliefs, for example, my values, talents that I have explored, my desires, my instincts, my feelings and aspirations, and etc. And all of the above are clearly inextricable from the world around me, from my environment, or from the symbolic realm. And when I have a conversation with someone as a philosopher, whether it's another philosopher or a random person on the street or one of my students, I listen to their voice. But prior to reading Nina's book, I was thinking that by voice I more mean all these things like values, aspirations. What is this person about? However, having become familiar with your work, another aspect of this debate has come to the fore, and I would like us to focus on this aspect in the very beginning. So you frame this acousmatic question along the lines of who is it who is speaking, and you suggest that when we posit this question, we should pay attention, not like in my case, to what is this person speaking about, what kind of values and etc., but the actual voice and my own perception of this voice and assumptions as well that I have and that are generated as I hear this voice. And you argue in your book that this skill to recognize, appreciate, evaluate, and listen to the voice in a particular way is absolutely essential for us not to fall prey to all kinds of damaging categories that are floating around in the symbolic realm, categories such as race, for example. And that would be the that's the outline, I guess, of our conversation. I think I've mentioned all the key points, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, Nina, about this acousmatic question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for setting up this conversation. So acousmatic, the root of that word, comes from the ancient Greek legend that described Pythagoras' disciples listening to him, as you must know very well, through a curtain. So a voice without seeing the originator of the voice, of the source. And then we can think about the Greek oracle, when you also have the source of a voice and you don't, or you have a voice but you don't see the source of the voice. And you can also think about darkness, a voice speaking from darkness, and you don't have the ability to see the body that emits that voice. I'm not sure if it applies to God's voice in the beginning of the Bible, but it's the commonality here that I'm trying to get to is a voice where we don't see the source. So then, much later in the 20th century, the French composer and radio artist, actually, Pierre Schaeffer, he used this term and acousmatic to create a new term, musique acousmatique, which he applied to his tape music and radio work. So here we have, technology, recording technology, being able to capture sounds and then being able to play it back. So you hear the sound of an action, even though the action isn't taking place. So the action is divorced from, the sound is divorced from the action. And for Schaeffer, he was very interested in thinking about or making music that maybe would be able to be so different than the original source sound that we wouldn't be able to trace it back to the original action that created it. So for instance, he has a very famous piece where there is like a door creaking, and we can actually hear that door creaking. But he was trying to think about, can we have this reduced listening, another term here, where we can just hear the creaking of the door without just thinking about the creaking of the door, without just connecting it to the action, but just hear the sound as a sound. So that's the origin of this term, acousmatic. So I use this, and I paraphrase it, I call it the acousmatic question. And what I mean by the acousmatic question is, every time I hear a voice, and that's something I do all the time, so it feels like a very common experience in my life, whether I actually see the source, like now I can see you on the screen and I hear, I see your mouth moving when you're talking. So I'm going to trust that those sounds are coming from your body, whether it's that situation or whether I'm driving, for instance, and listening to the radio and hearing a voice there, and I don't see the voice source. I'm asking myself silently and unknowingly the acousmatic question. And the acousmatic question is what you said, who is this? Who is speaking? And I never hear that question in my head, but I have the answer ready. It's very automatic. It's like this. It's a man. It's a woman. It's an old person. It's a foreigner. From whichever framework we're listening. So it's very, very hard. For Schaeffer, his frustration was that people couldn't just listen to the door without, the sound of the door without thinking about the door. Why can't people just hear the sound of the door as a symphony, just as music, but always bring it back to the door? For us, the question is why? And when we hear a voice, why do we always bring it back to some known category that matters to us within a given society? So, the things that matter to us are actually quite hard to articulate because they're so total that it's hard to know that they even matter to us. So for instance, gender. If I ask somebody, what matters to you in your life? What things do you feel you need to have some certainty about? I think most people want to have certainty about gender. What is the gender of the person I'm interacting with now? But it's so kind of quote unquote natural that we wouldn't even put that probably on the list of things that matter. But that comes forward when I hear the radio and somebody who maybe isn't listening, have headphones on with something else, would say, oh, who spoke there? I would say, oh, it's a woman. I would immediately say that. So that means that I had already quietly, unknowingly asked myself the question, the acousmatic question, that derived that answer, a woman. And then, of course, we go into other categories such as race, as you already mentioned. So the question is then, when I hear something that I associate, and this is a very important term here now for me, something I associate with what I also associate with womanness or femaleness, what do I do with that? If I hear a sound that sounds like a creaking door, the other part of this then is that people who make voices, you and me, everybody who voice, we also ask ourselves the acousmatic question all the time. So I identify as a woman, So I want to be heard as a woman then. So I'm going to all the time, throughout my lifetime, I have been thinking about whether or not I sound like a woman, within the context that I operate in. But of course, I haven't really consciously asked myself that question. But I know it's so ingrained in us that we know when we go outside and the vocal performances that we want to carry out, and that are expected of us. So what I'm trying to talk about in this book is that we have very set sounds, vocal sounds, and we know how to identify them, within the context. We know how to identify them. But the question I want people to think about is, how did all these people start to perform in these different categories? So with that question, I want to divorce voices from anything essential. So even if I think your voice sounds like a man's voice, that doesn't mean that you're essentially a man. It just means that you performed in the way that I expect a man to perform. There's some commonalities there between, I think about them as genres. The genre of man that I have in my head and your voice, and I compare the two. Then we can go further into, why do you perform like that? Do you want me to experience you as a man? Are there other things you want me to experience you as?
That's very good. I'll just quickly comment on your perception of my voice. I've really been exploring myself more and more, the masculine voice and the feminine beats and etc. And I start realizing the more I try to shake off the cultural expectations of me as being man and talking like man and dressing like man and etc., the more sounds I make that are natural and instinctual to me, typically while making love. But I guess that's where you begin. And they are not entirely masculine at all. I'm not sure whether they're feminine or something, but they are like that other that is coming out of me every now and then. And in those voices, sounds, gasps, sighs, I start recognizing something else, something that is opening up. I'm not sure whether I can divide it into the gender categories, at least at this stage, but they surely feel good because they're natural and they result from some inner work, essentially, from trying not to sound the way that I'm accustomed to sound, trying to surrender. I guess that would be the best term that can kind of capture how I feel sometimes about my own voice.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because I have a saying that is like, the voice is what happens before the sound. So when we hear the sound, the actions that created the sound has already happened. So like I can't take that you just heard, I can't take it back. I can only change the next second or millisecond of that sound. I can do but again, like the sound that is heard cannot be changed. It happened. The thing that made it happened. So I think about the voice as an inner choreography. So voice is not the sound, it's what happens before the sound. And that which happens before the sound is this inner choreography. So the that I made, it's it's the same pitch, it's the same vowel, just a very neutral vowel. It's called tongue down, lips passive, it's not protruding. Like in a oo, for example, the lips go forward. So and then I just change my throat to be more narrow and then more open. More narrow, more open. And that's the inner choreography. So most of us, if we are not trained singers or if we don't train with our voices in very particular ways, that gives it a vocabulary and asks us to continuously experiment with it. We don't think so much about the movements. But what happens, of course, from the very beginning is that we are, as babies, we are rewarded for starting to move our mouth and tongue in ways that then starts to form like sounds, that we can start to think about the syllables, etc., etc. So we are constantly training this inner choreography, and then it becomes a language. and then we kind of close in and are able to just pronounce more or less the sounds within that language. And then when you talk about the sounds that you make that you're kind of surprised maybe about that to hear yourself making, and maybe delighted, and those sounds can maybe even show you parts of yourself that you didn't know about before. I believe those are because you are physically doing something. You may not be giving your voice, your throat, like a specific signal to say open up now or close down now or do this or that, but you are doing something physically with your body, and then you're exhaling, and that will be a sound. If you exhale and you allow your vocal folds to vibrate, that's the sound. And then whatever form your throat is going to have in your lips and the whole body, because it's of course connected to the torso. So just think of like lifting a heavy box or something heavy. It's because it's a physical movement. You have to close your vocal folds to create a vacuum inside your body. It's called the Valsalvo maneuver, to be able to be strong, to have like this core that you're lifting from. And that's the sound, not because I want to make it sound, but because the body's just physically doing this. So that shows us, and that maybe, in your lifetime you have made sounds within maybe 10, 20, I'm just randomly estimating here, I'm just trying to show a low number, like a much smaller amount of your vocal capacity than your vocal apparatus and all of you as a physical being actually have. So that also, and of course, again, like if you had grown up in a different culture, you would have a completely different set of syllables and consonants and everything too. So that's another kind of potentiality that we're not realizing. Most of us speak just one or few languages. So I think one of the most interesting things to do with people when we're together is to, for example, just think about like how low can you go in your, vocally? How high can you go? How creaky can you go? How kind of heady can you go? And everybody can make all these sounds, but we don't use them. We use just a very narrow bandwidth of our pitch, for instance, and also timbre and many other things as well, like consonants and vowels. So that is something that people can explore, to just see the full range of their voice, and then to consider how little part of that full range they actually use.
That's very interesting. Something that I recently learned as well. I think there's amazing studies being carried out in vocal somastetics as well. And I've learned a little bit from Annie Tervainen, who is a Finnish scholar working in vocal somastetics, a couple of things. But one of the things that she suggests is spending time in nature and being attuned to your environment, with the sound of the winds, with the sound of the birds, the sound of the creeks, all of, being mindful of all these sounds taking place around you and trying to be attuned with them, in that trying to imitate them. So there's that old idea of imitation as a necessary part for creating something of your own comes into place here. And I've been practicing that a fair bit, and it's quite amazing. The kind of, obviously there's no way I can sound like a creek, for example, or the rustle of the leaves. But when I try to imitate it, first and foremost, it's very entertaining. It's really consuming, and it really challenges you in all kinds of ways. And I've been very, very surprised by the kinds of sounds that I make. And most importantly, I find that activity to be very therapeutic. In many ways, I derive much more meaning and joy and education by having this dialogue of sorts with natural phenomena, rather than with, say, a random person in a bar. And we often just end up having, I don't go to bars often, but sometimes you just meet a person and you often just have meaningless, shallow conversations which lead nowhere, and you forget about it next day. While these kind of conversations, if it's a dialogue or whatever it is, that phenomenological engagement with nature around you by means of your voice, you suggest that in your book that there is no essence essentially underlying one's voice, whether it's white essence, black essence, and etc., etc. While there is at the same time a very tangible conflict between your interpretation and I really love it. It's so open-ended and so incredible and wonderful. It opens up anything to human beings. And at the same time, as soon as we engage with that symbolic realm in which we operate and live and engage with our day-to-day activities, it seems that it almost represses or conditions all of these potentialities. Would you agree with me?
Maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic.
Okay.
I think to think through this, it should give some optimism I think it's an optimistic message because I think it gives a kind of key. It gives a kind of recipe for how to get out of it, actually. So that's, to me, is the optimism. Because if we know that I am the person who's projecting maleness over your voice, and I can start to think about why that is, and I don't need to make myself wrong. I can just say, oh, interesting. I answer the acousmatic question, this is a male. Like, who is this? This is a male. And then I can start to ask, who else might this be? So I can think about, oh, he's a scholar, he's a philosopher, he's a partner, he's a friend, he's somebody who sings with leaves, he's somebody, I can start to think about all the different aspects of you once I have understood that the first assessment is just an assessment. And once I know that it's just an assessment, I can open up for the full range of you. And on me too, right? Because if I open up for the full range of you, it's easier to open up for the full range of myself. And I have to, the more open I become, the more of you I can know. So I think it's optimistic in that way. And it's also optimistic in the way that when we also get I do get really outraged by racism, for instance, we can also understand some of the mechanisms underneath that and see that it's a cultural phenomena. It's not just individuals that I can then make wrong. I can understand how they're part of a larger pattern and how I am also part of it. Maybe I think myself woke or knowing some things in some areas, but I am committing these essentializing assessments all the time. And I can maybe think, oh, but my degree of essentializing assessments is lesser than this person, who is, I won't name like what groups I'm thinking about, but I think it just kind of brings us down to the place where we can just see the mechanisms and then maybe address them. And also, it opens up for, as we talked about earlier, it opens up for being able to explore one's own voice more. And once you start to explore your voice more, then I think you open up for the possibility for others as well. I was thinking, like, if you go out and not just imitate leaves or just imitate the creek, if you're just talking to the creek in your own voice, like who would you be then? If you, Valerie, are talking to the creek in your own voice, like, would it be different or the same as if you talk to your friend or like a boss or something? Like, who do you have to be to talk to a creek? So I think at least my goal is for it to open up.
How about I think I certainly agree with you, and what you offer is extremely optimistic and humbling at the same time with respect to that question of self-knowledge and knowledge of the other that I mentioned in the very beginning. My pessimism really stems from the abundance of people who evaluate you using those categories that are damaging in all kinds of ways. Overall, I would say they're spiritually damaging. That would be my way to frame it.
There are real lives online. I don't mean to make light of it, but I just wanted to stress that the reason for doing this work is to find an opening, we know what's damaging and spiritually hurting about the way that we operate as human beings. So I want to try to find openings. I do think, like, too, though, that, like, for this, in terms of like the spiritually damaging, I think there can be some light even in knowing that, in knowing the limitation of those who listen to us and make and kind of put us in those corners of essentializing us in racial terms, for instance. I think it can give some strength, but again, I don't want to make light of it. I mean, we know that people are killed, people are held hostage, people for generations, centuries, over these kind of ways of assessing one another, and that's important to remember.
Yeah, thank you. How about we focus now a little bit on the crux of your argument, and it seems to be that at the very center of your interpretation is this, as you put it, greatly undervalued phenomenon of vocal timbre.
Mm-hmm. So timbre is, like, one way of explaining it is that it is the sound of the sound, and on the kind of very high level, like on the most generalized level, it's what makes you hear one sound, just again the sound source, like a trumpet from a voice, for instance. Timbre helps you understand there's a trumpet versus a voice. So if the trumpet is playing the same da, for example, and you sing da, then we hear the difference. And the reason, when it's the same pitch, is that we hear the difference in timbre. And then each sound source can vary its timbre. So all those are different timbres of me on the same, again, vowel. And then I think we have an overall kind of sound of our voice. So we can say, oh, that's Valerie's voice, that's Nina's voice, that's X, Y, or Z's voice, and that's the timbre. So if we say exactly the same words, or sing exactly the same melody and words, but you hear a distinction between one voice versus another, that the timbre is the distinction. But then the reason I'm very interested in all this too is that there's a long tradition within Western thinking to think that the voice is, the sound of your voice is from your interiority. It represents you. It is you. It's the essence of you. And I think there's so many beautiful ways of thinking about that. But it also is damaging, as we talked about, because then if I hear the sound of, let's say, a white voice or a black voice, and I think that's the essence of that person, then and that essence, I'm using that in a negative way, in a limiting way for that person. That's very dangerous. Then, if I understand that also to represent their inner interiority. So if there is a sound timbral, like a vocal sound timbre that I associate with blackness, and to me, that's just a sound that's been created through a specific kind of way of moving that person's vocal apparatus, their throat, their mouth. But if I associate that with blackness, then I can use that as an evidence of the undisputed blackness of that person. So it's kind of like, to me, it's like planting the evidence, because the category of like the black voice has been developed, and it's really like a cultural heritage, not a essence of a person's body. It's so the way that I have developed this work is that people have talked about race in terms of dialect, sociolect, like the way that words are being pronounced, the word choices, for instance. You can think about that in terms of regions, but people also think about that in terms of like social groups. So, and race often form a social group. But I've been trying to even say, like, when somebody sings exactly the same song in exactly the same way with exactly the same pronunciation, so you cannot distinguish the region or the social group from the pronunciation or the word choice, then why is it that you hear that person is white or black or Latino or etc.? So I tried to work with that in a very kind of controlled way, because a lot of popular music, each person pronounces the words in slightly different ways to kind of give their own style. So I worked with opera, within an North American context. And there, in opera, to be a successful or a hired opera singer at the major opera houses, you have to pronounce the words in exactly this correct way. And opera singers have training for years and years and years in diction. And unless you do it in this very specific way and also don't alter, there's no like personal kind of flair in the singing. So everything is more or less exactly the same. So then still, how is it that people very distinctly feel they hear blackness or whiteness? So I did a whole study on that, and the words that people use when it comes to black singers is very racialized. Amber voice, black velvet, chocolate, etc., etc. So very coloristic kinds of words. So that is an interesting phenomena, and people are able to derive that. And that was also another kind of question that I tried to. Took a long time to try to understand what was going on, and again, you had to go back to how people are listening with their eyes as much as with their ears, and how there is a need to distinguish people into racial categories, and then we do that. If the society requires that of us, then we will.
If a person engages with another person's voice via some medium without actually seeing them, and recognizes, for example, as you say, that this is a voice of a black person, right? So you are arguing that in that evaluation, we kind of inject certain prejudices about blackness of that person. Am I correct? So by recognizing a voice as black, we already impose on this person, certain preconceptions, racial, cultural, class preconceptions about that person. And I will just give you one example. For example, in Melbourne, there is a suburb on the outskirts of Melbourne. Obviously, it's called Dandenong. It's the suburb which is populated by all kinds of immigrants, mostly from, I'd say, India, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Nigeria. So it's really funky. It's really funky, very unusual in comparison with the central parts of Melbourne. Or the prestigious parts of Melbourne scattered around here and there, which are obviously predominantly radically white. So when I go to Dandenong and I hear those voices speaking English in very different ways to the ways I am accustomed to hear English, being mostly around white Australians, it somehow it doesn't pierce my ear, but it's unusual. It's like it makes a tremendous impact on the way I perceive the person because of that difference, as you put it in your book. I can sense the difference in voices, and at the same time, I certainly fall prey to that kind of a habitual way of thinking about the kinds of voices I hear, though I do not impose any like a racial. I do not infuse in my evaluation any racial negative conceptions, because I typically approach a person as a person first and foremost. Like I have trained myself not to see those distinctions as much as I can. Obviously, I'm not perfect, but I try to see a human being out there. And you are suggesting in your book that typically, if I discriminate between different voices speaking English, in a conventional way, like a white way, for example, American or white Australian here in Melbourne, and someone who learned English as their first language, but their parents, for example, are from Somalia or Ethiopia. And obviously, the way they speak this language is very different. A typical person, by hearing that English speaking voice, but a different one, would at the same time evaluate this person in light of some racial prejudices that somehow crept in their psyche, by means of news, whatever they get their information from to understand the world around them.
Now, again, I think these categories they feel so natural, quote unquote, to us that we don't even think very much about it when we make these assessments. It's helpful to go outside of one's own listening context to kind of see or hear the way that we actually evaluate voices. So I live in the United States now. I've lived here for 20 years, but I grew up in Norway. So the example I often give is that if my mom were to be played, if somebody played for her the voice of that in the United States would be very immediately heard as a Black voice, she would just think it's an American voice because she doesn't have the context, American English voice. She doesn't have that context to distinguish between the various American English voices. To her, the distinction would be American English or British English, for instance. She's more familiar with that than Australian English. And then so that's kind of one thing, right? You have to have access to that knowledge. You have to be enculturated into that knowledge in order to be able to distinguish. So you have to be, again, educated into it. It's not something we just know. So I have acquired this knowledge here, but this is contextual knowledge, and any of these bodies could have grown up in other places and learned to speak in different ways. So that is like one of these points, that each of us could talk and use our voices in an infinitive amount of ways, and they could be associated with social groups. But typically we're not doing that. Typically we have enculturated into one voice, or maybe a few voices. We have all these kind of variations within it, like our official voice, our friend voice, our parent voice, our sibling voice. But we still recognize that, let's say, gender, race, etc. It remains throughout those kinds of vocal performances that we have. So, and then the other point is that the same, race is also just not configured the same in each context. So let's say, like, characters that maybe many know, for example, President Obama.
Here at
Obama,
one of the largest army bases in
another
America.
very public figure in the United States said about Obama that he talks white. So why did he feel the necessity to point that out about Obama's voice? He felt that necessity because he made the assessment that Obama is Black, and that his voice was associated with something he thought about as whiteness. It's also about the policing of who gets to speak in which kinds of ways, or use their voices in which kinds of ways. So this assessment was Obama crossed the line. He did something he wasn't supposed to do vocally. He was imposing, he was performing. He wasn't showing us vocally his essence. Then so Obama, as probably most of us know, is a biracial. He was born to a white mother and a Black father. And then you have somebody like, I'm not sure if this person is known in Australia, but Trevor Noah, a comedian who has a very well-known television show here in the United States, but is originally from South Africa. And he's same background, like a Black mother and a white father, so biracial. But in South Africa, he was considered not Black. He was considered white, but he was not completely accepted as white either. So then, what should we say about his voice? Is he talking white? Is he talking Black? Is he doing something he shouldn't do? So the same body composition doesn't even receive the same racial category, right? So it's incredibly messy and complicated, like any of these assessments we make. So we have to know, like, we cannot make these assessments unless we have been educated into them. So even the assessment about like looking at somebody and thinking about who they are racially is completely different from Brazil to the United States to South Africa. So that's one. And then the voice is the same thing. We have to kind of know those cultural categories before we can make the assessment. So they're not essential. They're not essence at all. They're made up. They're completely made up. So that's really the point I'm trying to get people to hear and see, like these things that we really rely on. They're wonderful things. I think there's so many wonderful ways we can use these vocal categories, but we just shouldn't. We cannot use them to essentialize people. We can just use them as amazing vocal performances.
Thank you, Nina. And I think to get your your primary message across, we should touch on the three correctives, as you put it in your book, about voice, because I obviously they form the key kind of a blueprint to drive your argument home, and I think all three of them are eye-opening. And I was wondering if you could please, for everyone, elaborate on each of them, because that's all new to me.
Okay, so I'll just say them first, and then I'll talk a little bit about each of them. So number one is that voice is not singular, it's collective. So you think about, here's my voice, I Nina, but it's not singular, it's not just my voice, it's collective. Voice is not innate, it's cultural. And then the third is the voice's source is not the singer, it's the listener. So, the voice is not singular. So when I speak with my voice, I associate these sounds that you hear now with my voice, but it's not singular in that I'm the only person responsible for it. It's collective in like all the ways that we've talked about before. The way that I move my vocal apparatus now, I didn't come up with that. I'm moving it in recognizable cultural ways. I'm trying to form words that we can both kind of know the meaning of. So it's collective in that way. So the materiality of my voice has come about because I did these movements on a daily basis. So it's the same as like a marathon runner or a sprinter. Like you get really different body composition depending on what you do every day. So that's the same with the voice. It's become this physical iteration that it is right now because of the way we collectively are moving our voices in these ways. And then it's not innate, it's cultural. That also goes really to the physicality, right? So it's not the reason I sound the way I sound now. It's not because it's the only way I can sound. It's the sound that I make because I want to. I'm within a social context. I'm trying to use my voice in a way that is understood across. And the voice's source is not the singer, it's the listener. The listener here in this way is not just you listening to me, it's me listening to myself as well. So I can try to communicate something to you, but in the end, you're gonna make your assessment. And I cannot change that assessment. I can try, but it's not up to me. So eventually, you are going to be defining who I am, through that cosmetic question. Who is this? And you can say, oh, this is a smart person, or this is a crazy person, or this is an illegible person, sorry. And then, a kind of other beautiful point is that when you do hear my voice, you're really the loudspeaker of my voice to yourself. Like I'm vibrating, even though we're like connecting through all kinds of cables and I don't know, all kinds of signals, you're still hearing my voice now in one way or another. And that means that I'm playing in your eardrums and into your inner ear. So in that way too, physically, you are my voice.
Philosophically speaking and hermeneutically speaking, it's a fascinating dynamic. In one way or another, we are intertwined. I have this voice only because I am deeply and irreversibly intertwined with the world around me.
Exactly. Yes, that's beautifully put. And there's so many kind of gruesome and beautiful examples of that. Like, and I think each of these phenomena can be both. So, for instance, neonates, like babies before they're born, we never exist without being entwined vocally with the world. We never have a voice where just by ourselves. So neonates, they're born knowing the language of the person who carried them. They don't know the linguistic meaning, but they can distinguish between the sound of one language, the one they know from the womb, to another, the sound of another language that they haven't been exposed to. So you come into the world already in a language, you're enveloped by a language. And also, apparently, babies who are born to mothers who do not speak or do not vocalize during the pregnancy, they are, and I quote here, they cry with a strange voice. So you are induced into your own voice through somebody else's voice. And that, they learn slowly, but you have to, somehow there's a connection there with listening and then getting your own voice. So again, like no voice exists in singularity. So in that way, we're entwined too, that it's a little bit like sourdough, like you have to have a starter from your collective community or from your community. And then we know also, like somebody you need to be spoken to really develop your vocality. And then it's so beautiful, I think, when parents or caretakers, they're really studying their little babies and they're so in love with them. And then the child is just exhaling and they do, ah, and then they maybe close their mouth and they go, ah, ma. And it's just a physical thing that happens. But of course, parents are going to immediately say, oh, those are the words, those are mama, or pa. If it's p is harder because it's an expletive consonant, so pa, or da, I guess in some languages. So we are so eager to hear our loved ones' voices and to communicate with them. So that also brings little children into a vocal world because we're willing to hear them and we're willing to interact with them. And then, of course, this is a huge reward. So then they continue developing in those kinds of ways. And then I think in my first book, Sensing Sound, I talk a lot about sound as really a physical entity. So in that way, I think we're really, really interconnected. I think about the whole world as, just this interconnected physical realm, and then you are a kind of energetic event where there's some sounds coming from, and I'm here with my being an energetic kind of event, and sounds are coming from me. But there really is a continuous material tissue from me to you, even though we're in very different parts of the world. And so in that way, we're interconnected too. And we know like how language changes collectively. There's so many ways to think about these interconnections.
Just one little touch on what you were saying, and we will move to the concluding part. And I have been moving away from the kind of the intellectual conception of the world or the cosmos or nature to the bodily one. And I've been influenced by a Russian thinker whose work has not yet been translated into English. He wrote 10 volumes of a book called History of Ancient Aesthetics. So it's 10 books. It took him 60 years to write it. And one of the key revolutionary, in my opinion, interpretations of that kind of ancient Greco-Roman worldview for him is that for them, fundamentally, the world or the cosmos for them is the body. And that's it. So that, we are all a part of one massive, eternal body. And the world around us is not just kind of, rivers and human beings and countries and relationships, but fundamentally at the most basic level, then the most important ontological level, it's just the body, and we are all part of that body. For me, it has been in many ways a life-changing realization.
To add to that, or to connect it, like in my first book, Sensing Sound, I define sound or voice as an intermaterial vibrational event. So that could be really anything. I don't think it has to be a human audible sound or a sound audible for humans, because of course we hear in a very limited range as well. Other animals can hear in the ranges that humans can't. So it could be, I think, any material entity can have a voice, not to humanize it, but I think we can listen way beyond like the audible.
One thing I have to mention before we move to the conclusion, since you are in lockdown at the moment, we had a curfew for a couple of months in Melbourne, and it was July, August, and September for 3 months. So after 9 p.m. there would be, you would have to stay home, otherwise you'll be fined and imprisoned, questioned, and etc. Quite interesting. Anyhow, I used to live back then not in the country like I do now, but on top of Mount Dandenong. Mount Dandenong is the mountain next to Melbourne. It's a beautiful, ancient, sacred part of the land by all means. And on the first night when the curfew was announced, I went to my regular place on top of the mountain just for a walk, and I was absolutely stunned by the fact that the city of Melbourne, which is very extensive, it occupies a large area, and when you're on top of the mountain, you're overlooking the entire city. And everyone, including myself, were so accustomed to the noise, to the voice of the city itself, and I was absolutely stunned that night because here I am on the top of the mountain and it's silent. It's completely quiet. It's for the first time ever, I think, that Melbourne expressed no noise, no voice of its own. It was completely quiet. Just in terms of perceptual aesthetic experience, I don't know, it was something hard to express. Very, very incredible. Yeah, a silent city.
Yeah, and you probably heard the sound that you didn't hear, like in even a louder way, just because you didn't hear it, right? Like when you hear it every night, then it's hard to hear it.
Yeah, the nature was speaking that night for sure.
Yes.
To me, it's very special. I would like to move to the concluding part, if you do not mind. So I already mentioned that this idea that we are driven to develop a form of kind of unique individuality in this world. It's very different from different cultures. Some of them are dead cultures where a person would more identify themselves, for example, with the tribe or the community and the city. In our society, we're driven by a hardcore individualism in many respects. Obviously, there are negative and positive aspects to that too. So in terms of developing the voice of your own and being in a position to recognize the voice of another, what do you suggest? What can we do to shake off or to kind of get rid of some of these shackles, metaphorically speaking, that are still in many ways around our necks and throats, kind of forcing us to speak in particular ways, not allowing us to to find that voice or to explore it or to cultivate it. I was reading through your book again this morning, and I was thinking, again, I was fantasizing. It was a futuristic kind of overview, and I was thinking, what are the implications of following this wonderful philosophy? And I'm not sure what they are to you theoretically and practically, but some of the things that I was thinking about is being able to speak in different voices, when it's relevant, when it's necessary, being able to speak in the feminine voice, in some points, or when I need to be firm with my son, for example, being a little bit more, firmer, working with my timbre in different ways, etc. When I need to speak with some bigot or a police officer who recognizes me as an alien, as a foreigner right away, what kind of voice do I need to switch on, and how do I need to tweak it to get the message across that I am not a foreigner, I'm not alien, I just don't have the Australian accent, for example. So how do we do this undoing, so to speak, of all these shackles? Well, what's your position on that in a nutshell?
In a nutshell. Well, I think first, I mean, there are many beautiful things about these too, right? They're vocal practices or vocal, I think about them as genres, instead of thinking about black voice or white voice or this voice or that voice. I think they're about them as vocal genres. So vocal genres can be developed, and people do that all the time. Let's think about like hip hop or rap, or like the way that the particular kind of vocal community has developed that further. So we can play with that. We can also cross those into different languages, and we can also cross into different kind of sociolects and ways of playing with our voice. I think we should be mindful of, again, who originated those genres. So it might not be for us to take on some of these vocal genres because they don't belong to me, to my culture, for instance, or somebody else's cultural heritage. So to be really respectful of that, whose cultural heritage, vocal heritage, am I engaging, and on which terms? And then, yeah, as you say, I think there should be so much room opening for being able to talk with the brook or the mountain or the sky, and of course with all the people in your life in all kinds of voices, especially I think children. And I saw a very funny a New Yorker cartoon today. I should send you a picture of it. It just has the picture of a man and a woman, and the man is leaning down to talk to the woman's dog, and it says something like, the dating progress or something came to a complete halt when she heard his dog speaking voice. So like with the way he was talking to her voice, to her dog, she just couldn't stand that voice. I thought that was pretty funny. So we can just really this idea of exploring the different parts of our vocality that we don't normally do. And it's also really just to open up to, I think the first lesson is just to hear, try to hear each person we encounter, to hear the multiplicity in their voice, and try to hear beyond that first answer, that answer to that cosmetic question that comes automatic. Try to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down, in terms of those answers to ourselves, and then we'll have just much more richer relationships, I think, to one another.
Good. I think we'll finish with an afterthought that just crossed my mind, only because you mentioned that we need to be particularly cautious around children. That's the question in general. The question of the child has been on my mind a lot lately for a number of reasons. My son is 8.5, and he's turning into a boy and struggling for all kinds of reasons. And my partner is pregnant at the moment. And with the experience of my boy, who is 8.5, one thing that I've noticed is that I've always spoken to him as an equal. I've always spoken to him as a little human being, essentially, rather than a child. While most of the parents that I know about, the kind of voice that they use to speak to their children, to me, I find it quite derogatory. It's that. I'm not sure where it all comes from, and at what stage in a child's development that kind of attitude, because in that style of speaking, they communicate that they talk down to them. They don't consider them as equals at all. While in my experience, we should consider them as equals, because it goes both ways. We learn from them a great deal. I've learned so much from my son, from the way he is, and he's learned a lot from me. So I think, would you say that for those of us who are parents or who are exposed to children, that would be a good place to start, and not least because kids are so fragile. They're not as thick, they're not as set in their ways as adults are.
Yeah, it's interesting that kids, even before they're maybe physically start to become more prominent into a man or a woman in the teens, that they start to sound like, these cultural categories of boys and girls long before the vocal apparatus would suggest anything like that. And they're also, even like with adult voices, there's much more overlap in the way that our vocal apparatuses are formed than our voices suggest. So we're really like emphasizing the part of our voice that will make us be one gender versus another, like the majority are. So children learn to articulate their voices in gender terms way before their bodies would suggest. So that's very, very interesting to observe, I think, and to talk with them about. My son is 9, and actually just randomly yesterday we talked about this, how his voice is not any different from the girls' voices in his class, and why is it that he thinks he sounds like a boy? Because he does think he sounds like a boy. There's a transgender child in his class, and that person talks very much in the gender that they identify in, of course, as my son does. So those are interesting things, I think, to talk with kids about, that there are those options, that they're actually asserting those options when they sound like a boy or a girl, or a non-gender conforming person. And I think, again, like, I just try to experiment as much as possible vocally with my kid. Like, we often, when I put him to bed, we do weird vocal kind of plays. It could just be like vocalises in weird ways or beautiful ways. And then we often play sketches where we, just made up sketches where we take different characters. So we know that, to have the knowledge that his voice can do many things and that my voice can do many things. And also to take moments when we make assessments about people, to think about why we make those assessments. But I think, to show them the possibilities is something that could be quite powerful, I think.
Of course. I think this way, one of the things that he can learn, and I will certainly pick this up as much as I can, is that whoever we are is quite elastic, and we are that multiplicity, as you say, rather than an essence defined by someone else, and no one knows who that is, essentially.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.